In this video, we're going to cover Spring REST global exception handling. Now, in the previous videos, we added code for exception handling. So we had bad data coming across, we had our REST service that would throw an exception, and then inside of that REST service, we had an exception handler that will actually pass back the exception as JSON data. That coding works, but the exception handler code is only for the specific REST controller. The coding can't be reused by other controllers. And on large projects or on real-time projects, you'll normally have multiple REST controllers. So ideally, what we need is global exception handlers. So this promotes the idea of reuse and also helps you centralize your exception handling and minimizes the amount of code that you need to duplicate across multiple controllers on very large projects. So to help solve this, we can make use of this Spring @controller_advice. The @controller_advice annotation, it's similar to an interceptor or filter. So we can use it to kind of pre-process requests to controllers. We can also use it to post-process responses to handle exceptions. And this is perfect for making use of global exception handling. And if you notice the name here, @controller_advice, this is actually real-time use of AOP, or aspect-oriented programming. So if you remember from the AOP days, we had the ideas of like a before advice and after advice and so on. So here in Spring, they make use of an @controller_advice. So this is AOP that you can use to kind of pre-process and post-process on controllers. So I love it. I get excited about this part because we can see some real-time use of AOP. So this is cool, and we'll do this in this set of videos. So now with this Spring REST exception handling, with this advice or the @controller_advice, we have our REST client, our REST service. We make a request across to the actual service. Then we'll have this controller_advice to kind of pre-process the request. And then the REST service will execute. If there's something wrong, we'll throw an exception. And now instead of the exception being in the REST service, the exception handler is going to be moved out and placed in the controller_advice. So this will give us support for global exception handling. So no need to write all the exception handling in each REST service. We can place it in one global location to handle all of those requests. And we can do all of that thanks to this controller_advice. As far as the development process, what we'll do is we'll actually create a new controller_advice, and then we'll go through and then we'll refactor our REST service. So we'll actually remove the exception handling code from our REST service, and then we'll add the exception handling code to the controller_advice. So it's basically just taking existing code and just kind of moving it around a bit and placing it in that global exception handler. So let's go ahead and start with step one of creating the new controller_advice. So all you do is you simply create a class here like this student REST exception handler.java, and you simply annotate it with the @controller_advice annotation. And this advice is from the actual Spring framework. So in step two, we're going to refactor our code. We're going to remove the exception handling code from our controller. So the coding that we had here for @exception handler, we're going to take this code and just remove it, and we'll place it over into the controller_advice. So then with step three is adding the exception handler to the controller_advice. So that code that we just removed from the service itself, we'll just place this code here in our student REST exception handler, and that's the same code as before. And the actual coding portion for this exception handler method is exactly the same. There's nothing special, no changes. We're simply moving code from one class over to another class. And this @controller_advice makes the code available on a global basis for our given application. And then just as a recap here, we have our client and our service. We make a call to the service. The controller_advice can pre-process the request. Our REST service will execute, and then we throw an exception. The exception handler code is no longer in the service. It's now in the advice. Those exception handlers will get triggered. We'll handle the exception accordingly, and then we'll send back the data as a JSON response to the calling program. So the big key here is that now we have these global exception handlers. So the code is no longer just stuck in the actual service itself. We can actually make use of it at the controller_advice level, and we can have multiple services that could all throw exceptions. And then here, they make use of the global exception handlers here. So this is pretty good, a better use of our coding. And this is actually a best practice for real-time projects and large-scale development. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our development process. So the first thing we need to do is create the new controller advice. Then we need to refactor our REST service by removing the exception handling code. And then finally, we need to add the exception handling code to the controller advice. And that'll give us support for global exception handling. All right, so it's step one of creating a new controller advice. So I'll simply create this new class in the REST package. So I'll move here to the REST package and I'll just say new class. And the name that I'll give for this class, I'll call it Student REST Exception Handler. And then I'll just kind of go ahead and expand the window here for a second. And basically what I need to do here is just add the @controller advice. So that's a special annotation from the Spring framework. I'll add some quick comments here to this class just so I know what I need to do. Alrighty, so for step two, we need to kind of refactor our REST service and remove the exception handling code. So I'll move over to student REST controller.java. And I'll expand the window here. And basically I want to move down to those two methods that we defined as exception handlers. So both of those methods with the annotation of @exception handler, I want to cut both of those methods and move them to another class. So just go ahead and scroll down, do a shift click to kind of highlight all of those folks there. And then we'll actually just cut both of these methods and move them to another class. So I'll just go ahead and cut. And then I'll move over to the exception handler, and then I'll actually just paste that code here. So it's really just a cut paste exercise. And this is the exact same code, so no changes are required for this code. You can just drop it in as is and use it in this @controller advice. So here's the first exception handler that we had for just handling for a student not found exception. And then the other one that we have is our catch-all for handling any type of exception, any type of generic exception. All right, so this looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and test it out by just running our application. Okay, it's up and running. I'll hit the get all students, and I'll just give all 9s here. Student not found. That's good. Okay, that works. And then I'll just give some bad text data here, and good. So this is all the same output as before. We simply just refactored our code to make use of the @controller advice for global exception handling. And so